Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called ILO? What is ILO doing to help promote economic development, as well as working to improve working standards around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our show. Today we're looking at the United Nations International Labor Organization, which is one of the major agencies within the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on the ILO. My guest today is Ms. Jane Stewart. Ms. Jane Stewart is a former Canadian politician who was the Minister of Human Resources Development from 1999 to 2003. Ms. Stewart was first elected to Parliament in the 1993 election, and she was later appointed to the position of Minister of Indian Affairs. She currently is a Special Representative and Director of the International Labor Organization's Office to the United Nations. Jane Stewart, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Bill, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk about the International Labor Organization, the ILO. When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, it's a most interesting specialized agency of the United Nations. We began in 1919, just at the end of the Great War, and as many countries were industrializing. And there were real issues in the labor market at the time. There weren't standards around hours of work or safety in the workplace or fair wages, and there was unrest. And this at the time when things were still in turmoil. So as part of the Treaty of Versailles, the International Labor Organization was created with the idea that to ensure peace, there had to be social justice, and there had to be justice and social justice in the labor market. So that's what got us started. But we're kind of an interesting place. You and I were just talking about it being tripartite. That means that not only is the International Labor Organization membered by governments, but also by workers and employers. And Bill, I'll tell you, if you ever get the chance to go to Geneva, where our headquarters are, and sit in on the discussions and the debates about the world of work that these tripartite members are discussing, you would be amazed. You would think, how could these parties ever come to an agreement? But here you've got the governments in the middle, workers on one side, employers on the other side, and they hash it out, and come up with really important decisions, undertakings that help improve our lives, because really, what do people want? A decent job.
Exactly. And you mentioned the fact that the ILO is one of the specialized agencies of the UN, but I believe you're the only one that has a tripartite system, and you bring together the key players, the governments, the workers, and the businesses, the employers, to come together at the same table and to focus on these problems. And that's remarkable that you can do it, especially if you look at today how so many parliaments and congresses and what have you in various countries are really fractured. There's a lot of divisions. Of course, you've been involved with politics, but it's remarkable you can get them all together under the same roof to do that.
And that was really part of the Founding Fathers' perspective, that they're not going to be able to deal with the sometimes what seem to be intractable issues in the labor market unless the parties in the real economy, so business and labor, are there with governments who then ultimately go on to make legislation or related legislation. And it is unique, as you say. It's the only agency or entity in the United Nations family that is tripartite. And you think here in New York about the amount of time that is spent trying to understand how best to bring civil society and the voice of we the people into the debate. Well, the ILO has done it for almost 100 years.
Exactly right. Well, I know you have 4 strategic objectives to the International Labor Organization. If we could just go through each briefly.
Yeah, sure.
The first, to realize standards and fundamental principles and rights at work. What exactly does that entail?
Just before we get into that, let me say that
Sure,
we
please.
have these 4 areas, but ultimately they make up something that we call the decent work agenda. From the perspective of the ILO, social justice can be found where we have decent work for all men and women. And the achievement of decent work is obtained through these 4 priorities that I think we're going to talk about now. The first, as you've mentioned, are the fundamental rights at work. And the ILO was formulated to generate and come to agreement on international labor standards. So the rules that can govern the labor market. And these are things that have brought us, hours of work. In 1919, there were no stipulations around the hours of work, and people were working long hours. There were no days off. There was nothing like a weekend. There were issues surrounding women in the workplace, because of course it was just after the war, and what implications were important in their reality. Children.
Child labor.
Exactly.
Yes.
Still an issue for us today. But back then there needed to be some agreement amongst countries of the world about how to treat labor. And I think one of my favorite phrases here is that labor is not a commodity. You can't trade on the backs of men and women. And these labor standards that are generated out of the International Labor Organization give direction to the world markets on how best to treat labor, how to build common and good outcomes for people in their working lives.
Exactly. And the 40-hour week was a non-entity. It just was not in the mix.
There was nothing like that. And safety in the workplace. I mean,
Exactly.
the occupational safe and health acts that countries have today come out of these discussions that the tripartite members of the ILO have had over the course of years.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, these problems are still with us today to some degree. Do you find that there's a lot of cooperation from the various governments and folks who can make a difference in dealing with these problems, be it whatever country X or country Y, that they actually want to be involved and to try to help improve the conditions?
Yes, well, we're 194 members. With workers and employers, so it's a big, when we get together in conference every June, it's thousands of people that come and discuss very important topics. Recently, the impact of domestic workers and people that travel from their home country to other countries to provide services and their protection. That was a standard that was agreed a couple of years ago. But these issues are worldwide. They're part of every country's domain. And so you do see very much an interest. And the standards are ratified by countries. Not everybody ratifies all the standards, but they still tend to live by the principles.
Exactly. Now, your second one is to focus on opportunities for decent employment and income. How does that work, and how can you help improve those conditions?
Well, as I say, when you ask people, what do they really want? They want to be able to look after themselves, their families, make a contribution, and they want a decent job. We come to work to make a contribution, to be productive. And so having the opportunity to have a decent job is a priority in the lives of really the citizens of the world. And so the ILO, along with its experts, understand the labor market. What do we have to do to make sure that growth, economic growth, results in increased numbers of jobs? There are some things that we have come to understand, that macroeconomic policy can't just be about inflation stabilization. It also has to think about creating employment. So making sure that there's a regulatory regime that encourages the creation of businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, the demand side for employment. And then making sure that workers have the skills that they need to take those jobs.
Exactly.
So when we're talking about increasing the numbers of opportunities, those are the sorts of things we talk about.
And I know in the United States, and now I think it's worldwide, there's been a heated debate, a very good discussion on the shrinking middle class, especially in the United States. And we see that there's even more of an inequity as far as income distribution. You see, we hear about the 1%,
right.
we hear about the lower 99% that's losing ground, the 1% that's gaining. But it seems though that in order for a society to prosper and for it to really improve economically and to thrive, that it really needs a vibrant middle class. You have to, in a market economy, you have to have middle class folks who buy things like refrigerators, stoves, automobiles, that type of thing. And if you don't have customers, you're not going to be able to start a business. It wouldn't do any good because you have nobody to sell your widgets to.
I would think you're an economist. Those are exactly the kinds of things that
Far
we
from
talk
it,
about.
I assure you.
But really, these are the economic issues that we really have to explore. And when people challenge the notion of a minimum wage, you have to say, well, if people don't have a decent income, they aren't able to purchase. If you don't have the demand of consumption, why are you making things? And so there's a very tight and close relationship between the labor, the labor getting its share of productivity and capital getting its share. And from the perspective of the ILO, really concentrating on the real economy, not, the economy of market investments and the stock exchange, but the real economy where men and women go to work, make a contribution, get fairly paid, and their employers reap the benefits from their labor and also have got their capacity to, the regulatory regime to allow them to be in business. Then we've got something that's binding societies, creating social justice.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today, we're taking a look at one of the United Nations specialized agencies, the International Labor Organization. My guest today is an expert on ILO. My guest today is Ms. Jane Stewart. Ms. Jane Stewart is the director of the International Labor Organization's Office for the United Nations in New York. Jane, we're talking about the importance of having a vibrant middle class, but I think it also ties in, this whole discussion ties into your goal number 3 to expand the coverage and effectiveness of social protection. First off, what does social protection mean, and then how do you expand it to cover the folks who would fall under this rubric?
Well, for example, people would understand in the context of the labor market social protection as being unemployment insurance. So when through no fault of your own you're sick or unable to go to work, there is some kind of support there for you, some social protection to keep you going ahead so that you don't lose everything and your family can still rely on some kind of income. So that's one example of social protection, of a social protection element. We talk about the importance of having social protection floors. And this is a notion of having universally available social protection, social securities that help us manage through difficult times through the course of our lifetime as needed. Those would be when you can't get to work because of your illness, or unemployment insurance when you haven't, through no fault of your own, be able to find a job, or when you find yourself when your business isn't there anymore and you need some support until you find another job. Another thing, and this comes back to the question of child labor, having supports for children. If kids need things, and it's not cheap to have children, right? I mean, kids need things. But having benefits for them allows their parents perhaps to go to work, but certainly not to put children into work. Healthcare. You can't go to work if you're not healthy. You don't want a healthcare system that will empty your pocket completely if you have an unforeseen illness. So having access to universal health care is one of those social protection floor elements. And then finally, we unfortunately, but it's true, all get old and can't always work right till the bitter end. And so having pensions in place and viable and vibrant is another piece of the social protection that's required.
Those are very important, and it's critical to have these to help people in time of need, not to be there forever. Well, Security could obviously be after you retire or something like that, but some of the other programs that you mentioned, unemployment insurance, can be
really looking through the life cycle.
exactly right, to help people get back on their feet and to help them sustain their minimal quality of life until they can get back into the marketplace or whatever the case might be. Now, the fourth one, I think we've already talked about to a large degree, the tripartism, and the social dialogue. How do you expand that from the three players to take it a little beyond that through social dialogue?
Well, this important notion of social dialogue is fundamental to the way that we believe policy in the labor market needs to be formulated. Everybody has to be able to have a voice. Now, this means whether you're in an individual enterprise as an employee, you've got to be able to convey what's working for you and what's not working for you. Dialogue with your employer and your employer with employees, but also at the ILO amongst governments, workers, and employers. So it's the idea that unless everyone has a strong voice, you don't get a good and sustainable outcome. And so we discuss that really at the national level, at the regional level, at the global level, saying that no matter at what level you're talking about the issues that deal with the world of work, workers, employers, and governments all need to have a voice and to dialogue about the issues and the outcomes.
Exactly. And no one of the three can operate in isolation.
That's
you
right.
have to be in contact.
We all need each other to get the proper outcome.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I know you're confronting a lot of major issues like improving safety standards, working with countries to try to prevent something like that horrible disaster in Bangladesh.
At Rana Plaza.
Over a year ago, I guess.
It's a year's anniversary. That's
is that
right.
what it is?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think 1,400 people died, or
We're
maybe
very
even
much,
more.
very much engaged there with the Bangladesh government, and they are seized by the catastrophe. And together with the multinationals who may have the goods made and then sell them here in the United States and around the world to improve the labor standards.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
right.
it's a horrible outcome. But occupational safety and health is critical. You know, Bill, 2.3 million people die every year at work. It's an undeclared pandemic. And it's such an important piece of the world of work, the labor market, to have a place to go to work where you're secure, you're not in danger, or you're fully aware of the dangers and can work with those.
Exactly. And workers should have proper equipment. They should have certain safety precautions and certain safety
They've got to know,
policies
they've got to
in
know
place.
what they're working with and
exactly right,
Yeah.
and not be told after they contract some horrible disease or lung infections or whatever the case might be.
So occupational safety and health is a big part of the standards that we were speaking about earlier.
Exactly, it certainly is. Well, there's another issue area, and it's a lot of people refer to it as a ticking time bomb, and that is unemployment, but especially with youth. You look at some of the countries, especially economically developing countries, that are not what we call the mature economy or mature countries like the United States or Japan, where there's more of a gentrification taking place, an older population. But with the young people, many of these countries, and you know them far better than I do, have large numbers of youth who are unemployed. What can be done to help them to get educated first so they can fill jobs, and then secondly to get these jobs and be productive wage-earning citizens or members of their society?
Yeah, you've put your finger on a very important piece of the policy agenda right now. After the crisis, the economic crisis, as you point out, unemployment's skyrocketed and the employment levels have still not come back for men and women of all ages. Currently, there are about 215 million people who are unemployed, many of them long-term unemployed now, and that's a big concern. But a third of those are young people between the ages of 15 and 24, a third. So 75 million young people who want to work and can't find employment. And to discuss what the particularities are, certainly we need to have economic growth for employment. It's got to, focus on creating employment. So that's the same for youth or for me. But young people have certain specificities associated with their You know, their school to work transition. Have they had schooling that is going to help them transition into the workplace? And so here we talk about different methodologies, including apprenticeship, and talking about the importance of the skilled trades and as an option. Options associated with entrepreneurship. Young people having the wherewithal and the knowledge about creating their own jobs and being able to hire others. But on the other side, you know, the employability skills. It's more than just book knowledge, but it's also technical skills and the soft skills that we talk about. And so supporting young people get those kinds of skills is another policy area that can assist in dealing with the fact that young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than those who are older. And so really understanding the particular realities of a young person who may get stuck in this cycle of no job, no experience, no experience, no job. You know how easy it is to say, well, sorry, you haven't got any experience, so I can't employ you. And the issue of, you know, it's the productivity that's required by employers, and having the time and the ability to invest in developing a young person. But these are the sorts of things that we talk about, and there are solutions.
Exactly. Yeah. And as you mentioned, if you can't get the job, you can't get the experience. If you can't get the experience, you can never get another job in this area.
So this is where apprenticeship programs and internships and those sorts of things can be particularly useful for young people.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle, and so you need to break that cycle. I was thinking, as you were talking, that the ideal situation is for people to be employed by the private sector. If the private sector is expanding, which we see that the stock market's expanding quite nicely, but the private sector, especially in the United States,
the real economy, as we call it.
The real economy is not moving along as fast as a lot of people would like. But I was thinking back, the private sector is great to create employment, but could the governments play a stronger role? For example, I know in the training they're involved, but I think back to the Great Depression with President Franklin Roosevelt, and he created the Civilian Conservation Corps. He created the Works Progress Administration, different programs to put people to work, working on projects to build bridges, to build roads, to do arts projects, to build buildings in various cities. But could governments do more in this area? I'm not talking about make-work projects, something that's just
useless.
There's
always work to be done.
There's plenty. If we look at our bridges that are deteriorating,
infrastructure
our aqueducts, the
infrastructure
is suffering, sure.
Well, and it's very interesting because we were talking about the economic crisis from 2008 that is still with us. We're still working our way through it. And the G20 countries were seized by the fact that they needed to do something, because in all the countries there were high levels of unemployment. And without the investment that governments made during that period of time, we would have seen far more people unemployed. And what did they do? They invested in infrastructure and greening buildings, or things, rebuilding bridges and roads. And those sorts of things are critically important when the market can't sustain, when the market fails. Governments have to come to the rescue of its citizens, of their citizens. And there are some that say, it's a cost. Well, from the perspective of the members of the International Labor Organization who discussed this through the period of the crisis, that's an investment. It's an investment on not losing your human capital.
Exactly, and it's a cost in the long run if you don't help educate that person. You can have somebody turn to crime, person can be in jail, be in prison, whatever. In the United States, it costs $35,000 a year to maintain someone in a prison. That's hardly a wise investment.
Bill, you brought us back to the very first question. Why was the ILO created? Because there was unrest in the streets, because there was unfairness in the workplace. People didn't have jobs. And when people don't have work, people want to be able to look after themselves and make a positive contribution.
Exactly.
And so, social justice does depend on a vibrant, well-functioning labor market.
Well, in the last minute and a half or so we have left, this is the hardest question. How do you balance? We look at sustainable development, we look at climate change that's taking place, we try to focus upon sustainability. How do you balance trying to create employment opportunities but still help preserve the environment so that we can have a future of sustainable resources for people who are coming in the next generation. How can we do that?
Well, Bill, this is the discussion here at the UN right now as we look at the Sustainable Development Goals building into the post-2015 development agenda that needs to be sustainable. And here we come back to this very important element of social protection. Because when people can count on social protection, when the economy is in transition, and right now we are transitioning the economy from a brown economy to a green economy to a lower carbon economy, it creates winners and losers. People lose their jobs, there are new jobs that are created, but to transition and to give workers confidence to transition or even move, be more mobile to find jobs, social protection is that platform that allows them to do it. So there are many things that we're doing, looking at the green sectors and finding where in specific countries there can be increased potential for new numbers of jobs, looking at the importance and robustness of social protection systems to allow for that transition. So we're very much engaged in the discussion around sustainable development and the role that the labor market plays.
Exactly. And these are all very important issues, and our viewers can go to www.ilo.org and get a lot more information about what we're talking about today, because we do need to learn much more about these, and we need to be involved, and we need to work on these sustainability items that you've talked about, because we're all in this together and we're going to rise or fall together. But Jane Stewart, the director of the International Labor Organization's office in New York at the United Nations, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Thank you.
Real pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.